Hi everyone! Welcome to one of our live virtual programs here at the Franklin Institute. My name is Dr. Jayatri Das and I'm Chief Bioscientist at the Institute, and I am here with a special co-host today. This is Asha. She's my daughter. She's 10 years old, and we've been talking a lot about the coronavirus and especially these days about the vaccines. And so we wanted to talk to you to find out what you're hearing about the vaccines and what questions you have, because this is an area of science that is really pushing the boundaries of what we've ever been able to do before. And we want to make sure that you have all the information you need to understand what's going on in the world. So go ahead in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. Tell us what you're hearing about the vaccines, what kind of questions you have, and we'll do our best to answer as many of them as we can. So, Asha, I have some news for you.
What is that news?
Because one of the things that everyone's been waiting for is to find out what people will be able to do after you get vaccinated. Because if you're like us, we've been kind of stuck at home for almost exactly a year now. And just earlier today, the Centers for Disease Control, which is an agency in the federal government that gives us advice on how to stay healthy, issued some new suggestions for what people are able to do. And their new recommendations are that once you've been vaccinated, and that means having gotten your full dose and waited 2 weeks, you can actually hug people.
I mean, probably with your mask on, but...
Not even with masks. So when you're out in public spaces, absolutely, you should be wearing your mask because until many of us get vaccinated, everyone needs to keep each other safe. But we've been waiting to hug your grandparents forever. And as your family, as your friends start to get vaccinated, what the CDC suggested was that somebody who's been vaccinated can meet up with somebody else who hasn't been vaccinated, as long as those unvaccinated people all live in the same house, so like just our family. But once you've been vaccinated, it protects you from the coronavirus so that we can give our grandparents a hug. And I'm really excited about that. So I hope maybe you are too, and go ahead.
Like grandparents in this case we're talking about can only hug one household?
Right, so say for instance, like we end up at your grandparents' house along with your cousins. We all gotta wear masks, right? Because your cousins aren't vaccinated, we're not vaccinated, we live in 2 different households.
Right, but, so we can't hug them. But if it's just 2 groups, then you can hug?
So
or is it, you have to choose between 2 groups to only be able to hug that group?
Right, so you can only be with like one set of unvaccinated people.
Ever? Until
everyone's vaccinated.
So you have to choose between...
Yeah.
Okay.
Right? So if there's more than one household of unvaccinated people, you still have to wear masks. But if it's just you and people who have been vaccinated, then we can relax a little bit.
Okay, so
and that's going to be great.
So does this apply to all the vaccines since they're all very different?
Yes. So the timing, obviously we can talk about this a little bit later. With some of the vaccines, you need to get 2 shots. The other vaccine, you only need to get 1 shot. But no matter what, once you've had your full dose, so whether it's 1 shot or the 2 shots, you wait the 2 weeks, and after that, this guidance applies to everyone.
Okay.
So that's really exciting. We're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel, but we've got to still keep our safety behaviors going for a little while longer.
So we have another question.
Okay.
So why do they report the dew point and why is it important?
Why do they report the dew point? So folks, if whoever asked that question, if you could give us a little bit more information about what you might mean here. Because the dew point is what I understand to be a environmental condition based on humidity. So it might have to do with what the weather is outside, but I'm not entirely sure how your question relates to vaccines. So if you could follow up with a little bit more information so we can answer your question, that would be great. But let's go ahead and start with some of the questions that we thought you might want to know. And the first thing that we want to review is what the virus is made of. And we decided to build our own model of the virus at home here because the virus is so tiny that it's impossible to see it. So let's bring on our other camera here so we can show you the model of the virus that we made. And this is something that you could make at home too if you had the right stuff.
So
all right, so Asha, walk us through what we're looking at here.
So here we have yarn that's inside the wiffle ball.
Okay.
And the body, I guess, as a virus is the wiffle ball. Then we have Nerf bullets as the spikes. And so inside, as you can see, we have some yarn, purple yarn that serves as RNA, which is basically the instructions for the virus so it can spread.
Right. So let's break that down a little bit more. So you told us that this wiffle ball is what we call, kind of the shell or the body of the virus. It's kind of what
like a casing.
Kind of a casing, yeah. Any one of those would work. So this is what contains and keeps the virus together. And then, Asha, as you mentioned, we're using these Nerf darts as spikes because that's one of the characteristics of a coronavirus is that you have these spike proteins sticking out of it. And then we've got this color-coded yarn that represents the genetic instructions, like you said, inside the virus. So how does this virus make you sick? So this spike protein is kind of the important piece of the puzzle here. Right? So how do we get sick? Like when we encounter the virus outside, what happens?
So I'm pretty sure that the spikes stick to your cells in your airways.
That's right. So imagine that, I say that I had an infection and I sneezed and lots of virus came out. Oh, right. So our virus is going to, maybe travel into your nose and your mouth if you're not wearing a mask and I'm not wearing a mask. And the spike protein is the part that's going to bind to your cells and make you sick. This RNA inside the virus
isn't it carried in the spike to start reproducing it in your cells?
Yeah, so the virus is inside the shell. But once the spike binds to your cells, then the virus can invade and start using these instructions to make more of itself. So then your body tries to fight back. And you have lots of cells in your immune system that start trying to attack the virus. But in some ways, it can be too late. So when people get really sick, it's because their immune system wasn't able to fight off the virus in time. So that's why we need a vaccine. So what do you think a vaccine does for us?
Well, it's kind of an obvious point, but it's to defend yourself against the virus.
That's exactly right. So let's talk about how a vaccine works. Yeah, you want to try it?
Sure, I may be wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure that there are multiple kinds of vaccines. But one vaccine, I think it's Pfizer, takes a piece of the RNA or whatever, and then packages it into cold fat, and then injects that as a sort of key that locks your immune system against the virus.
Yeah, you got the gist of it here.
And sort of introduces your immune system to the virus in an unharmful, unsick kind of...
That's a technical term. All right, let's use our model to talk about what's happening here. So, like Asha was saying, a vaccine introduces your body to a part of the virus so that it can prepare without actually making you sick. And in this case, our spike here is that part of the virus that we're going to introduce to your body. And so what all of the vaccines do in slightly different ways is to take just the piece of the genetic instructions that codes for the spike and delivers it to your body so that your own body can start making these spike proteins. And the great thing about that is that because it's just a spike, that means your body's ready to recognize anytime it sees a spike protein come along. But because the vaccine doesn't have the whole virus, it can't make more of itself and get you sick.
So how come some vaccines require 2 shots and others require 1?
Right, so that's a good question. So thank you for sending that question in. Let's talk about how these vaccines are actually made. And that'll help us understand why the difference between 1 and 2 shots. So Asha, you mentioned the Pfizer vaccine. There are 3 companies that are making vaccines that are being distributed in the US right now.
Right.
So 2 of them, one is called Pfizer, the other one
is Moderna.
Moderna, right. These 2 vaccines work in very similar ways. So let's talk about those 2 first. Okay, so here's our virus that we're going to put aside for the moment because now we're into vaccines. And these use a version of the instructions, and you kind of talked about it. What these do is essentially take that virus and package it into a little bubble of fat molecules. And we're using our little Ziploc bag as a model for the fat molecules that help the vaccine basically slide into your body. And once that's in, that's what gets injected into your body, and then your body gets those instructions back out, starts cranking out those spike proteins, and gets your immune system ready to go. Now, with this kind of technology, it's not quite as potent, it's not quite as strong in terms of getting your immune system going. And that's why you need 2 shots of this. It's like the first shot is the first introduction, and the second one is a little bit of a booster to kick your immune system into gear.
So Moderna and Pfizer were very similar?
Yeah.
And then the Johnson & Johnson, I think, was the other one?
That's right.
It was different? Is that the one that only needs 1 shot? Is it stronger, or what happens?
Yeah, so the Johnson & Johnson one uses a different technology. So we've got another version of our model here. The Johnson & Johnson, instead of using this little bubble of fat to deliver the instructions,
instead, it still uses some of the RNA, I believe, but it packages it into a cold virus.
So yeah, you're on the right track here. So this one uses the instructions in a slightly different version. It's called DNA, and it just means it has 2 copies of the instructions attached to each other instead of just 1, which makes it a little bit easier to keep it stable. So one of the things that's really tricky about the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines is that you need to keep it super, super cold, like ultra, ultra cold, special freezer cold kind of thing. Because the Pfizer or the Johnson & Johnson one is a little bit more stable, you can just keep it in warmer conditions that's easier to manage. But for the Johnson & Johnson, instead of using the coronavirus that makes us sick, we're delivering the vaccine in a different virus that's a specially engineered cold virus that can get into your cells but doesn't make you sick. And the way that the vaccine works, and you can build our vaccine here, is that once again, we have the genetic instructions for the spike, and those genetic instructions are basically combined with this virus's own genetic information. So once we have
you said it combined. Does that mean that your body will also pick up some of the cold virus, like this stuff of the cold virus, so the immune system won't just protect you against the corona, but since it took in some of the cold virus, it'll also take care of that?
That's
or
right.
It go in separately?
No, that's right. So essentially we're giving your body the spike protein as part of this other virus. But this virus basically has all the bad parts taken out of it. So it's a harmless virus for your body. And just like what happened with the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, once your body has the instructions from this other virus, it starts cranking out the spike protein, and then that helps your immune system kick into gear. But this vaccine is a little bit stronger in terms of how quickly it can get your immune system moving.
Is that why this one only needs one?
Exactly. So hopefully that helps everybody understand a little bit of the difference between the two types of vaccines that we have. And there are other ways to make vaccines too, and there are more companies all around the world that are working on these different technologies. And so I expect that we'll be seeing some other types of vaccine in the coming years as well. Okay, so now once your body has recognized the spike protein, when you're out in the world and the coronavirus comes along, your body is ready to see this virus and say, hey, I remember seeing these spikes because I remember that from the vaccine. And so your body is ready to go, it's ready to fight back, and that helps you not get as sick.
Right, so is it your whole body that fights it?
So your immune system is really focused in certain parts of your body, but it flows throughout your, essentially what we call your lymphatic system especially. That's all of the fluids that, where all your white blood cells are to help fight off infection. But it's not like in your muscles.
So it passes through your body, but it's like the immune system that throws down that wall?
Exactly. And so your immune system works in a couple of different ways. So let's stop sharing for the moment here. And so one way that your immune system fights back is by creating molecules called antibodies. And these antibodies, if you had this little spike, is a molecule that recognizes the shape of the spike, what it's made of, and say, hey, this is a spike. Let's fight back.
So
you also have a different type of immune response where you have other kinds of cells called T cells that find cells that are actually infected with the virus and kill those cells. So you kind of got a two-stage response.
Yeah, so 2 questions. One from me, one from chat. So do we have an idea of when kids can get it and why it's taking so long?
Yeah, that's a great question. So right now, it's mostly just, I think 16 is the youngest that one of the vaccines has been approved of.
So are they testing on kids?
So, but they are testing right now. So why does it take so long? So you want to make sure that a vaccine is both safe and effective before you give it to anyone. And generally, because kids are still growing in different ways, we don't start out by testing new experimental treatments in kids. And so healthy adults is where we start. And then once it's tested in healthy adults to make sure that it's safe, then we test it in a wider range of adults to make sure that it's effective. And that's kind of where we are right now. That it's been shown to be safe and effective in adults from 18 or 16 in some cases, all the way to elderly folks. So that's really great because what we found out with this particular disease is that COVID is especially dangerous for older people. So it kind of makes sense that we want to make sure that the vaccine gets tested in the people who get sickest from the disease. So far, what the data have shown from the science is that kids don't get as sick. So it's okay that we've kind of waited because more older people have been getting sick. Mm-hmm. But now that we're there, now it's time to get focused on kids. And the way that we develop new treatments for kids is we kind of work our way down in age. So right now, the trials that are going on are for kids that are like 12 to 16 or 12 to 18. So you're not there yet. But we'll do it in phases. So that'll be the first phase. And these companies, again, depending on how many volunteers they get, are hoping to have a vaccine for teenagers by later this year. They're starting to recruit volunteers for the next group, and that might be from 6 to 12-year-olds. So that could be you.
I forgot what I was going to say, so I'm going to ask another question.
Okay, well, let me just finish up and say, so it's that would be the next phase, and then following that, then you get to like infants and seeing how young babies can be before they can get this vaccine.
Okay, so I remember my other question.
Okay.
So how do they know like when to start testing on kids? Because like you said, kids are still growing.
Mm-hmm.
So like how do you know when the vaccine works for kids? If like something changes in them.
That's right. Yeah.
How do you know when that changes so you can make sure that they get it either before or after to make sure that it's effective?
Yeah, that's a good question. And part of it is that we study kids longer before the Food and Drug Administration signs off that it's safe. So for instance, the vaccine trials, the tests that happened last year, the FDA signed off on starting to administer it after looking at 2 months of safety data. Now, what we know about vaccines is that most of the side effects that can happen that could potentially be dangerous happen very, very soon after you get the shot. So 2 months is reasonable for grown-ups. But for kids, we're probably looking at 6 months of safety data. Because again, we want to make sure that we're tracking kids long enough to feel good that this is not going to hurt kids. Right. So that's another reason why it takes longer, because we need to study kids for longer before we sign off that it's safe. Okay, so one of the cool things, Asha, is that there are lots and lots of people who have been working really hard on making these vaccines. But it's Women's History Month, and we like celebrating Women's History Month here in our household. And I wanted to introduce all of you to 3 of the women scientists who have really been leading the charge on these new vaccines. So Asha, why don't you share our screen here to introduce these 3 scientists to our audience here. And let's talk about them from left to right. So on the left here, Dr. Katalin Karikó. She is a Hungarian scientist who now works for a company in Germany called BioNTech. But she used to actually work right here in the Philadelphia area at the University of Pennsylvania. And she studied RNA for vaccines and drugs before anybody thought it was cool, like decades ago. And it was tough. When she was studying it, nobody really believed that it would pay off. And so it was really hard for her to get her work, to get money to do her research. But she stuck with it. And here we are, decades later, and her early work on RNA has really been a game changer for making these new types of vaccines possible. So let's move to our next one, Dr. Kizzmekia Corbett. Do you remember which vaccine we were talking about that she's worked on?
I think she worked on Pfizer?
The other RNA vaccine.
Moderna.
Moderna, right. So she is a scientist at the National Institutes of Health. And she's kind of a rock star because not only has did she actually lead the creation of some of the first lab-generated spikes that have made a lot of the research on COVID possible, but she also led some of the testing in animals for the Moderna vaccine that helped with the early stages of figuring out whether this vaccine would actually work.
So you mentioned she tested in animals?
Uh-huh.
So is there, how do you know if the virus, is in an animal? Is it exactly the same? What's different about testing? There's probably got to be at least something different by testing on animals instead of humans.
That's a really good question, too, about how research gets done, is that, again, because we want to make sure that we're trying to keep it as safe as possible when we're experimenting with new drugs, we always test them on animals first. So you might start with just cells in a dish, right? And we can develop different tests to see whether a virus is floating around in a dish or whether a vaccine has been able to track it and help the cells fight back. Then you might move into mice and see whether mice are able to fight back with this vaccine, because that's our first experiment of looking in an actual animal body system.
So, like, you talk about mice, right? But if you're trying to gradually go from animal to human, then wouldn't you want to go with something more closer to human, like monkeys?
Yeah, so there is some work that is done in monkeys, but it's done very, very carefully. And this is true for all animal research, because nobody wants to hurt animals unless it's absolutely necessary. And there are obviously risks, and so these are questions that scientists think about really hard. How do we make it as safe and as comfortable for animals as possible while still getting the information that we need? So that's a really complicated process, but that's still very necessary in order to make sure that we're getting safe treatments for humans. And so our third scientist here, Dr. Catherine Jansen, she works for Pfizer. She's the head of vaccine development there. And so she was really one of the leaders in getting the other vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine, through all of these testing processes and out to the public. So again, there's so many people who have worked on these vaccines so hard. The fact that we've been able to do it in a year is really amazing. And it's great to honor women like these three scientists who have played such an important role in making that happen.
So all these people work for different vaccines?
Yeah, so actually Dr. Carrico and Dr. Jansen have both had a role in the Pfizer vaccine, but Dr. Carrico's work has been, helps us generally understand how that RNA works. So it's been important for both.
One has more, so of the two that work for Pfizer, one is more into the RNA part?
Yeah, you can think about it like that, yeah. Because scientists ask all different kinds of questions, and it takes teams of people to come together and make things work. So let's finally kind of wrap up with thinking about what's next. So one thing that maybe you've heard about is that there are new versions of the virus that have been found in people, and that's making us ask some questions about how well are these vaccines going to work. So let's bring our camera back again. Okay, so this was our original virus that we color-coded with purple. And remember that each virus has its own set of instructions that are packed inside that virus. And if we think of the original version being represented by these purple instructions, what we know is that those instructions are always changing. Every time the virus makes a copy of itself, it makes mistakes. And most of those changes don't really matter. But every so often, there are changes that come along that do make a difference.
And one of the big ones would be that the color changes.
Well, not the actual color, because actually viruses are so small that they don't have color. But in our model here, we are representing a new version of the virus with this green yarn. And so now we've color-coded our spikes green.
So how does, you said that the virus changes as you can do in the model. So how does that affect how the vaccine works?
That's a really good question. Because remember how we talked about the fact that when the vaccine is in your body, what your body is doing is making more copies of the spike, right? So that it's training your immune system to recognize this spike. Now, if our spike changes from the purple version to our green version here, then all of the training that your body has done for the purple version might not work as well in recognizing the green version. And that's what scientists are studying right now, is trying to figure out how well the vaccines can recognize and respond and get your body to respond to these other variants, these other versions of the virus. And so far what we can see is that they're not quite as good, but they still absolutely protect you from getting really, really sick. And that's the most important thing. But we might need to tweak the vaccines to make new versions of the vaccine that are matched to these new versions of the virus. Does that make sense?
Right.
And in that sense, the big advantage of the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines is that they're really fast to make. You can just make a new version of the instructions in the lab, stick it inside our packaging here, do some testing, and it's a lot faster to get a second generation of the vaccine ready to go than with some of these other methods of making vaccines. So hopefully we can start getting people vaccinated, the quicker the better. Let's stop sharing here so we can see if there are any other questions that folks have here. Because the more people that have the vaccine faster, that means that the virus has less of a chance to make copies of itself. And the fewer times it's making copies of itself, the fewer times it's making mistakes, so the less it spreads, the less it changes. So that's what's going to give us our best shot at bringing the number of COVID cases down. And all scientists that I've been talking to are pretty hopeful about what our summer might look like. We've got these really great vaccines. We're making more of them every day so that more people can take them. We're going to be able to be outdoors more, right? It's so much nicer to when you're not vaccinated, it's safer to be outdoors with other people than it is to be indoors. So that's a good thing. And now, based on what we've heard from the CDC today, we might be able to even start hugging our grandparents again.
Or anybody.
Or
if they're like, what? We're going to choose this group. Here's a hug.
Right. So, you and I can still hug each other anytime. But I do want, we still need to be careful. So when you're going out to a store, it's still really important to wear a mask, whether you've been vaccinated or not.
Because you don't know who has vaccine and who doesn't. Exactly.
And so it's just a way for all of us to take care of each other. But when you're just getting together with, people that you know in a small group, you can share who's been vaccinated and relax a little bit based on these new guidelines. So with that, hopefully the summer will bring us some opportunities to get out and have some fun, and make some progress in getting rid of this virus. So thanks to everybody who joined us today. Keep sending us your questions. We're back here, generally every month with a new update on where things stand with the coronavirus. Asha, thanks for joining us today for our special kids version of this program, and we hope that all of you will come back and visit us at the Franklin Institute as you feel more comfortable with getting outside. We are open with lots of safety protocols in place. We have a great new exhibit about around Crayola and the art of creativity and design. So we're really looking forward to seeing all of you back as we get control of this virus. So thanks a lot, stay safe, and we hope to see you soon. Take care, everybody.